Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. In the last week, we looked at Nimrod's schedule for the new mini European tour. There is a slight change in his schedule. The change is that instead of being in Switzerland on 26th of June, he would directly be going to Paris, France on 26th. The rest of the schedule remains as is, and that is that he would be starting in Slovenia on 22nd and 23rd of June, Saturday and Sunday. Then he moves on to Italy, Milano on 24th and 25th of June, and then directly goes to Paris, France on 27th June. He'd be there until 28th June, and then finally in United Kingdom, London, where he ends the tour, and he'd be there from 28th to 1st of July. Again, if you want to get involved, the email address to contact is theeuropeantour2024@gmail.com. And if you also want to get involved in that ending London event, you can also contact Lawrence Anton. Global Priorities Institute is a research organization at Oxford University, and they organize lectures in the memory of Derek Parfit every year. One such lecture happened on 12th of June, Future Suffering and Non-Identity Problem by Theron Pummer. Theron presented a framework on the basis of 5 points. There is a requiring reason for not creating miserable lives. That is, we ought not to create people who are going to go through a lot of suffering. There is a requiring reason not to bring happy lives as long as they contain some suffering. That is, due to the degree of the suffering, there is a requiring reason to not create that life. There is no requiring reason to create happy lives just because they contain happiness. But there is a permitting reason to bring happy lives. That is, one is not required to bring such happy lives, but they can if they want. And lastly, there is a requiring reason to create a happy person with more happiness than to create the same person with less happiness. Based on these, Theron analyzes many different variants of non-identity problem and claims to demonstrate a solution for that without having to reach antinatalist conclusions. Now, the recording of this lecture is going to be available soon as per the organizers, and I'm waiting for it. But one highlight in the lecture was that most probably Peter Singer was also present in the audience. Sarah Diarna is translator of David Benatar's paper on the misanthropic argument for antinatalism into Italian. This week she has published an interview of 3 antinatalist philosophers, and it looks like this is part of an Italian magazine called Revista Culturale. It's a textual interview of David Benatar, who, as we all know, is a moral philosopher and an antinatalist philosopher, Alberto Giovanni Biuso, who is a theoretical philosopher and an antinatalist, and Théophile de Giraud, who is a French author of many books on antinatalism and an antinatalist activist. It's a short interview of just 8 questions, but has interesting perspectives as each question has 3 answers from 3 different philosophers. It also seems to be part of a larger conversation Sarah has had with the 3 of them over a period of 2 years of her research. The questions range from their personal relationship with antinatalism to various arguments for and against antinatalism. Now, the whole interview is quite interesting, but I am just going to highlight 2 particular answers, one by Théophile de Giraud and another one by David Benatar. One question was about the attitude that people in general have towards life, that life is beautiful. And Theophile's answer to that was quite like how Schopenhauer would have answered it. Talking about the structure of life itself, Théophile says, "The evil is enough while the good runs away. It turns out to be much easier to be unhappy on this planet of incessant conflict than to find happiness there. Doing nothing is enough to overwhelm us with suffering, while on the other hand, stubborn efforts are not always enough to guarantee us bliss. This law alone removes any optimistic pretension. How can we deny that the worst is always at our own fingertips than the best? Unhappiness is easy to find and sometimes very lasting. Happiness is difficult to find and often very weak. In all existence, evil therefore largely outweighs good a priori." And then there was a question about animals in antinatalism, to which David Benatar's answer was particularly interesting. "I have always maintained that all my arguments for why it is better never to come into existence apply not only to humans but to all sentient beings. However, when it comes to reproduction itself, there is a crucial difference between us, the animals that we breed, and the wild animals whose procreation we do not control. Procreation and breeding can be morally wrong only for those who are capable of making the relevant moral choices, namely moral agents. Normal adult humans are moral agents, but other animals probably are not, at least with regard to procreation. Accordingly, other animals cannot do anything morally wrong in reproducing, even if it would be better if they did not reproduce. There was an article in Washington Examiner with the title Antinatalists Talk Like Conspiracy Theorists. And the title is a little bit of a misnomer. The point of the article is that birth rates are declining globally. They are declining faster in some countries, they are declining slowly in some other countries. But on an average, birth rates are declining. This is going to cause a lot of economic problems in long term because the populations might start shrinking in a few decades. The article says these are facts, but whenever some serious scientists, economists, or political scientists, and so on start talking about it, there are people who start replying like conspiracy theorists. And to prove their point, they use some media or social media influencers. So, for example, they quote a tweet from Mike Duncan, who has like 126,000 followers. And Mike Duncan claims that all these pro-natalists who are talking about declining birth rates actually want to have teenage pregnancies, and that is why they are talking about this. This is Mike Duncan's claim, and the article says this is why antinatalists are talking like conspiracy theorists. They give another example of Paul Krugman, who says that the economic argument for pronatalism is actually weak, and so we are just left with the family argument, family value argument. And then he sarcastically gives example of Donald Trump and says that see how fatherhood has shaped Donald Trump. So that's another example. And they also quote another example of Lydia DePhillis, who says that the declining birth rates is actually a good thing for planet and for societies, and we should adapt to these changing situations. But the article says that these are replies like conspiracy theorists. Now, my point is that there is no point in denying the fact that global fertility rates are declining. There is also the case that the reasons for these declining fertility rates are not for the philosophical arguments for antinatalism. They are not antinatalism proper. They are something else. They could be financial situations. They could be gender gaps in terms of resources and pay gaps and so on, and many other reasons, but not antinatalism. The actual antinatalists are a very minority group, unfortunately. And so that is not the main reason for these declining birth rates. Secondly, even if you want to criticize antinatalists for that and say that antinatalists are actually talking like conspiracy theorists, then you should be taking examples of prominent antinatalists like David Benatar or people like those to say that antinatalists are talking such and such. To use some people who are not, I don't know if they are even antinatalists or not, and to then say that antinatalists talk like conspiracy theorists, in my opinion, is a misnomer. Maybe they didn't mean antinatalists as in the way we mean antinatalists, but then the title says antinatalists in it, and that's the objection I have. But at the same time, we should be careful to not deny these facts, because it's true, the birth rates are declining. Now, there are some people who are using these facts in some particular way, and that brings on to our next part, which is a video talking about it. There was a video by a channel called Cheyenne Lin. I hope I'm saying that name right. They had put up a video with the title Pro-natalists and the Underpopulation Conspiracy, a Deep Dive. Now, this is a big channel. It has like 147,000 subscribers. This particular video itself got 37,000 views in 3 days. And they have this video, they're criticizing the pro-natalists. It is divided into 2 parts. Before we go into those, what the video says, let me clarify that this is not coming from an antinatalist perspective. The video maker does not seem to be an antinatalist. They in fact are a parent. They say that in the video. I don't know if they are biological parent or adoptive parent. Nonetheless, they have a child. And what the arguments that they are putting, the criticism that they are doing of pronatalists is not coming from antinatalism perspective. But since they are criticizing pronatalists, that this is interesting for anybody who is interested in antinatalism. Now, the video itself is divided into 2 parts. In the first part, they present a case where even though these are facts, the declining birth rates are a fact and people are having lesser children and they're having even lesser in developed world and so on, these are all facts. How these facts are used by people on the ultra right-wing side or white supremacy side, to propagate their own propaganda, and the video claims that they are weaponizing these facts to propagate their racist attitudes and propagandas and also misogynist attitudes. They say that they are using these facts to restrict women's rights and bodily autonomy, and at the same time they are also in opposition to immigration, and the reason for that is their racial attitudes underlying to all of this behavior. They give example of Viktor Orban, who has openly said that we don't want immigrants, we don't want people from outside, we want pure Hungarians, and that's why we want Hungarians to have more babies. They give this example. They also take examples of other countries. They go in depth about how other countries are facing declining birth rates, what those countries are doing. They take examples of South Korea, examples of Japan, France, America, United States, European countries, and so on. Of course, Viktor Orban, Hungary, China, Russia. They take examples of a lot of countries about how the birth rates are declining, why they are declining, what are the governments doing to arrest that decline, and how they're failing to arrest that decline also, and then explain how the ultra right-wing and white supremacist people are using these facts to propagate their own propaganda. And they do this. I thought this was a very good job. It was a well-researched video. They have taken a lot of examples to prove their point. Now, the second part is about a specific pro-natalist couple, and that is Simon and Malcolm Collins. We have also done a video about it. There was an article about Simon and Malcolm Collins in The Guardian, which caused a lot of controversy because that mentioned how Malcolm actually slapped his 2-year-old child for a trivial matter in public place, and then instead of feeling remorse for that, actually tried to justify it, saying that they have learned this parenting technique from tigers. We made a video on antinatalism this week, one of the episodes in the past. I will put the link of that in the description. You can have a look at that if you're interested. The second part of this video also talks about this entire article. It goes in depth, piece by piece, about the flaws in Simon and Malcolm Collins' way of thinking, way of having children, and way of raising children also. And what they also say is that the usual stereotype of conservatives is conservatives are uneducated or rurally raised, or this is a stereotype, of course, again, even though it's on the conservatives. But they say that Malcolm Collins and Simon Collins actually break this stereotype. They are well educated, rich, capitalist people. They do proper jobs. And even then, below this superficial layer of being educated and progressive, underlies their bigoted attitudes. They say they are bigots. This is the claim by the video. I'm not saying that. The video says that these people are at the root of it. They're still bigots. They're still racist. They have a racist agenda, even though they put on this veneer of, these facts and sort of being progressive and atheist and secular and so on. That is what the video says. I have been very careful about not painting the entire pro-natalist movement by the same brush of saying that, they're racist or misogynist or anything. But that seems to be the case in view of this video. Overall, very well-researched video, very assertive video, and therefore very interesting video to watch, especially if you are an anti-natalist, you would like to watch criticisms of pro-natalists. Now, take this video and take this criticism with a bit of a pinch of salt, but still worth watching. There was a video called Why Parents Regret Their Children on a channel called M's Wild World. Now, this is not, again, an antinatalist video. It is not made by an antinatalist, and it's not made from a perspective of antinatalism. It is just talking about the observation that there are many parents who actually regret having children after they have had children. The video goes deeper into the reasons why people might be regretting having children. They start from the historical accounts of how nuclear families have evolved right from 13th century in England to now all over the world. They also talk about inequalities in terms of gender when it comes to parenting responsibilities and so on. But the main point I want to point out is that it's a fact that many people do feel regret about having children later on after they've had children, and there are subreddits dedicated to these kinds of people to find a support and to express their opinions and so on. The video refers to those subreddits. The point is, whenever you're trying to take a decision, there is always a risk that you would regret taking that decision later on in the future in your life. Now, this is not something the video says, but what I feel is about the decision about having children, there are two possibilities. You can either decide to have children, and there is a then probability that you might regret that later on after having them, or you might decide not to have children and regret that decision later on in your life that you didn't have children. Now, if you compare these two scenarios, in one scenario you regret, you're still suffering out from that regret in both scenarios. But in one scenario, you're regretting having children after creating them. So there is somebody who has been created, they are going through all the suffering, and now you're regretting creating that. In another scenario, you're regretting not having children, but nobody else is harmed by that. It's just the suffering of that regret emotion that you have to go. And I think my personal opinion is the second scenario is better to bet on rather than the first one. Anyway, that's not the point in the video, but I thought since we are looking at this video, I should bring it up. There was also a video on Exploring Antinatalist podcast by Mati Hairi with the title Moving On. The thing is, they had published a book, Antinatalism, Extinction, and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. The book has been written, published, launched. All the events have been done. The book now is available for anybody to read. Now they're moving on from there, and Mati thought that he should make a video about some clarifications with reference to the book. And he makes 3 points in the video, as you can see on the screen. One, he talks about the Silenesis wisdom, which is quoted also in the book, that it is better not to be born. The second one talks about the terrors and horrors of existence and therefore coming into existence. And the third is about the relationship with parents, and especially relationships of antinatalists with parents. I think this particular third point is worth exploring further in terms of how antinatalists' relationship with their parents is, ought to be, should be, and so on. Mati gives a few examples. He presents a general example of antinatalists and their relationships. Also, he also mentions that Benatar's example, where Benatar actually has dedicated his book Better Never to Have Been to his parents, ironically enough. Whereas Mati also gives an example of his own relationship with his own parents. So interesting video and an interesting topic to explore further. Animal Advocacy Podcast posted 12th episode, which was an introduction to Artificial Sentience. It was an interview of Michael, the space science guy, who has a PhD in space science, and he has also worked for other institutes like Sentience Institute and also for some animal rights organizations. So a niche combination of many hats he wears. In the episode, they talk about the importance of artificial sentience and the importance of preventing it from coming into existence from an antinatalist point of view. If you think this is just some sort of science fiction and we should rather focus on existing beings, then this episode is for you. They highlight why artificial sentience is so risky. For example, you could have a large number of artificially sentient beings compared to the biological ones. They can replicate very fast and they are at a greater risk of being exploited. Once artificial sentience is created, it would probably be impossible to stop them, and it would also be impossible to stop their exploitation. Take an example of horse-driven cars. They became obsolete not because people felt a moral need to stop exploitation of horses, but rather because they were better alternatives that were provided by technology in form of automobiles. Similarly, there is also a hope that sometime in future, if lab-grown meat becomes a sustainable alternative, then animal slaughter would also become obsolete. But what can replace artificial sentience, which itself is born through technological advancement? So this is quite a complex subject, and I think we should take it seriously. The video was interesting, and I must also appreciate John for asking the kind of questions he did in the interview. It reflected the homework he himself had done on the subject. A new book called What Are Children For? An Ambivalence and Choice was published last week. It is written by Anastasia Berg and Rachel Wiseman. And since then, quite a few podcasts and articles have come out promoting the book. We covered one such podcast and an article in the last week's episode of Antinatalism this week. Now, this week, there is a new podcast on Common Wheel podcast interviewing both the authors, Anastasia and Rachel, about the book. They discuss the radical shift in attitude towards the question of having children, and the fact that this question is even asked is radical enough. Part of the reasons for this shift, according to them, was that people in the past used to think of themselves as part of a collection. They used to think of themselves in terms of their relationship with others. But gradually over time, we have moved on to a society which is an individualistic society. Combine that with the advancement in education of women, with more secularization and so on, the cost that people have to pay for having children in comparison to the alternatives that they have is quite high. So this opportunity cost is one of the reasons why people are having fewer children. Now, they also touch upon philosophical arguments about bringing a new life into existence, but they do this through a very narrow lens of today's situation, like climate change and so on. So they ask a question whether it is right or wrong to bring a new life here in today's world, in today's situation. That is slightly different than regular antinatalism, which asks a question irrespective of what time you're talking about. Along with that, there was also an article in New York Times written by the same authors of the book, Anastasia and Rachel. The title of the article was "The Success Narratives of Liberal Life Leave Little Room for Having Children." The title itself reveals that they are going to criticize liberals and progressives for not having enough children. In the article, they generally talk about the book, and we come to know that it is more about America-centric. It is United States-centric. They interview quite a lot of people only from America, and they also talk about political discourses within America in terms of Democrats and Republicans. So it's very America-centric. The article criticizes left liberal progressives of United States for not having children or delaying the decision to have children. The book seems to be more about observations of societal attitudes towards the question of having children rather than philosophical arguments, but the article also makes some sweeping philosophical statements which are questionable. The article says that women today are facing involuntary childlessness, although they don't use this term specifically. But what they say is that women who actually want to have kids realize that about their desire in their late 30s, and by that time it is far too late. So what they are saying is that this liberal mindset, this liberal propaganda, if you will, is robbing these women of their agency to take a decision about having children. They also say that having children is not necessarily in contradiction to being liberal or progressive. At one point, they say that there is nothing inherently unprogressive about embracing the prospect of having children. It further says, while certain conservative visions of family life, such as Stratwife and Silicon Valley pro-natalism, no doubt have little to offer to those on the left, our fellow progressives need to stop thinking of having children as a conservative hobby horse and reclaim it for what it is, a fundamental human concern. Now, this is what I mean by questionable philosophical statements. I agree that having children is not necessarily in contradiction to being liberal or progressive, but is that the fundamental human concern? Don't other animals also have this concern, and is it the only concern that humans have? Can there be something more fundamental about being human? I think there is, and that is the concern about suffering, the way of thinking about ethics and morals, the capacity to have moral agency. These are specific to humans and are fundamental than the concern of having children. In fact, saying that having children is a fundamental human concern is to reduce what a human is to just an animal evolved through natural selection. Another interpretation of fundamental human concern could be that for all the things that we as humans assign value to, that could be art, culture, nature, societies, and so on, they all need humans to stand on. In that way, a continuous production of humans is a fundamental requirement. But then we end up in a circular logic. What we are doing is, in order to value things that we value, we are creating valuers so they can keep on valuing the things that they value. That is a circular logic. At another place, they say that is life, however imperfect, however challenging, however fraught with political disagreement and disaster, worth living? Now, this is a wrong question to ask in the first place, because there are two questions here. One, is existing life worth continuing? And two, is a new life worth starting? And while thinking about having children, we must ask if a life is worth starting, especially when the life that we are going to start has no interest in getting started, and it would not be harmed by not getting started. And that's why we should be asking if it is worth starting and not worth living. But the authors go on in a different direction when they say that having children remains the most basic and accessible way for most of us to affirm the value of our lives. So the concern is not about the child that is going to be brought into existence. It is just about us. I think if we need to bring someone into existence to affirm the value of our own life, then that is arrogant, narcissistic, and self-centered. They also say committing oneself to long-term leftist causes like economic, environmental, racial, and social justice is more than just compatible with embracing children and family life. It presupposes a willingness to take personal and collective responsibility for the next generation, raising, nurturing, and educating those who will decide the fates of our country and our planet. There are several problems with this, but I'll just point one out. That caring for the next generation may not be the only precondition for you to commit to these so-called leftist long-term causes. There actually could be many preconditions, but the most fundamental would be the concern about suffering. It would be the concern to reduce or eliminate suffering and prevent creation of new suffering. I'm not saying that this is the only precondition that there could be. There could be others also, but this one is the most fundamental of all of them for one to be able to commit to all these long-term causes. For example, there could be a concern for equality or equity in terms of distribution of resources, and therefore they might be fighting for these long-term or so-called leftist causes or justice movements. But you could question the reason for having equity in the first place, and thus through a series of why questions, you would finally land on the concern of suffering. And that is why I'm saying that the concern for suffering is the most fundamental concern of all. And if that is the case, then raising the next generation with a long-term goal of continuing this cycle of reproduction infinitely, or just fixating our vision only on the next generation, both of these behaviors are in contradiction to the fundamental concern of suffering. Finally, their last paragraph is even more contradictory. While describing the differences in the visions of progressives and conservatives in America, they say that progressives must not let partisan loyalties stop them from thinking about the ways in which having children does or does not express their values and what shape they really want their lives to take. Children are too important to allow them to fall victims to the culture wars. If they meant that progressives not having children is somehow making those non-existing children victims of culture wars, then that is plainly incorrect. That is because those who don't exist yet have no interest in coming into existence. They cannot be harmed, they cannot be deprived of anything, so they cannot be victims of anything. Secondly, if progressives bring children into existence to express their own values, as the article says, then in fact those children are made victims of culture wars. Because they are used as a means to express the values of progressives, they are used as a means to progressive end against the conservatives. That is clearly being victim of a culture war. So I'm not sure if I have misunderstood what they're saying or if there indeed are some inconsistencies in what they are saying.